Hello, and thank you for joining our LinkedIn Live. I am Jackie Kivers. I'm CEO and co-founder of Convosphere. I'm joined today by my colleague Abhinav Banja, who is head of Pharma Insights at Convosphere, and our partners at 9010, Kate Paxton, the US head of 9010, and Rick Evans, the social strategy director at 9010. Today in this LinkedIn Live, we are going to be sharing the ASCO and the Hybrid Congress experience learnings. So as we have listened to the ASCO conference online conversations over the last 8 years, we've learned a lot from what the participants and stakeholders have felt about the Congress experience. And as we've gone through the kind of online conference as opposed to the in-person conference and now the hybrid conference, there is a lot that we have to share about what this hybrid Congress experience means for pharma in the future and how to learn from some of the insights that we've gathered at this year's ASCO conference. So during this LinkedIn Live, we are going to be sharing a high-level view of some of the insights that we've had from listening to the stakeholders who attended either online or in person. We're going to be sharing our kind of insights, and Rick and Kate are also going to be sharing some of the so what you should know about that and maybe learn from and do differently at future conferences and congresses. Then we're going to be sharing some recommendations from these findings and insights, followed by Q&A. So if you do have any questions as we're going along about any of the stats that we're sharing, any of the recommendations, please do put those in the LinkedIn chat and we will address those in the Q&A. This is being recorded, so you are able to share it. And we do have the deck with further insights. If you're interested in having a copy, please just let us know following the event. So as I mentioned, we've been using social listening to understand the online conversation, conversation trends, topics, information that's being shared at ASCO over the last 8+ years. So ASCO is one of the largest conferences that happens. And this year it took place over 5 days, June 3rd through 7th in Chicago, Illinois. So as you look at these kind of conversation volumes, these are the total tweets that happened at each ASCO over the last 8 years. So up until 2020, it was in person. And the conversation that was happening online was primarily happening on Twitter. So this is different oncologists who are attending, different pharmaceutical company employees who are attending, all kinds of different stakeholders, as well as patient advocacy groups, hospital organizations, and others. So what we really saw was that back in 2017, 2018, there was a real peak in the total volume of posts that happened over the days of the Congress. And then as we went online to have the conference solely online in 2020 and 2021, there was a definite dip in overall total volume, but there was the same kind of percentage of stakeholder participation. So it was all of the same stakeholders participating and tweeting, but just at a lower rate per author or individual. This year, the conference went back online and in person. So it was a hybrid event, allowing attendees to attend virtually or in person, or in some cases, both. And again, we saw the numbers of tweets and conversation volumes start to go up again.
Thanks, Jackie. It's really interesting to see on here how conversations have gone back up. Now people are attending in person. It clearly suggests that healthcare professionals are much more engaged with the content when they're there in person, which actually makes sense when we think back to conversations we heard healthcare professionals having online during the purely virtual years. It was actually really hard to stay engaged in the content when they were multitasking. Also, when users are using digital devices to watch the content, it probably seems likely that they're less likely to be using the same devices to post about it at the same time. We should also consider that there's less urgency to comment on the virtual content as it's accessible for a long period. So what that means for us as marketers is we need to work harder to have those unmissable news hooks that mean people want to see it live.
And so there are 5 days of the conference, and as you'll note, people are conversing in person during the sessions, between sessions, and over the course of that Congress. So of the 63,325 tweets this year, those were coming in every day, but unsurprisingly, the real peak was right in the middle of the conference session. So this is really interesting in terms of if you're thinking about your engagement strategy or your content strategy, when you want to get content in front of people, or when you want them to actively engage with your content or conversations.
Yeah. So clearly the middle of the conference is where things are noisiest, but we should understand that there are actually really good opportunities before the conference and after the conference, if we want to get ourselves heard. There's also an interesting case study from AstraZeneca, who several years ago made a pledge to stop using paid promotions or tweets at ASCO, understanding that they were a big company with big resources and should be listening to their stakeholders, as opposed to putting paid promotion behind their resources. And they got a lot of credit for that. And I think they sort of turned a negative into a positive, and it made, I think, people realize that we should be doing a lot more listening and watching about what the conversation is, but looking for opportunities before and after to either point to data or point to an initiative or recap and summarize the meeting. So something to think about.
Okay. So when looking into key stakeholder groups, we can clearly see that HCPs were the biggest stakeholder group by far who were engaging at the conference. And we can also see that this actually has increased over time. And as compared to 2020, when the conference was a virtual one, their stake has actually increased by 9%, right? So this can be attributed to the fact that now the conference being an offline one, in-person presence is there, and clearly HCPs are more engaged during this event. The other big stakeholder groups are organizations which are cancer institutes and research institutes who are also very actively engaging at the conference. Then we have pharma companies whose share has slightly decreased in 2022. This is this year's conference. Another interesting finding that we can see at this year's conference is basically patients and advocacy groups engaging. So this is interesting because they are engaging around topics like not only sharing like content around the treatment and disease areas and awareness generation, but they are also talking about in-person attending the conferences and engaging with other patient advocates. So this is an interesting phenomenon that we see this year, which typically we have not seen in earlier ASCO conferences. Okay, so when it comes to HCP shares, so as I've already highlighted, they were the highest. But we also see an incremental increase in the share of conversation. So it has been the highest in the last 8 years. And so basically they are driving a lot of the conversations out there. And one interesting fact that I would like to highlight over here is that we have typically seen that HCPs are kind of the biggest stakeholder group when it comes to conferences, not only ASCO but overall. And they factor somewhere in 35 to 50% of the conversations. But this is not the case when it comes to general disease area topic related discussions, because wherein they generally have, I think, less than 10% conversation shares. So this is a very good opportunity area to basically listen into HCP's opinion, behaviors, and what they think about the different kind of disease areas, as well as clinical trials and research and treatment options. So conferences do give this opportunity.
And the rise of healthcare professional participation in social media at congresses, it's not exclusive to ASCO and oncology, but it's still actually really incredible to see how much things have changed. So, I mean, I've been working in social media in healthcare basically since it first started. And in 2015, we were still having conversations in which our pharma clients questioned whether healthcare professionals actually use social channels, and certainly really questioned whether they were using them for professional purposes, which was probably true at the time, that it wasn't really used so much professionally. Whereas these days, our clients know that this increasingly millennial healthcare professional workforce are using social media, and it's more about knowing how they're using it, where they're using it, and why they're using it. And at this, which is probably the biggest medical congress of the year, we can see how much healthcare professionals turn to social media during these important milestones. And even if the pharma industry or our pharma clients, if we're working at an agency, are not producing social media content at these times, there is always a huge opportunity to use them to listen and to learn from the community.
One of the really interesting things, as we've been listening to and monitoring ASCO over the last few years, has been when it shifted to an online conference away from just the in-person, it really opened up opportunities for people and professionals further afield to start taking place in the conversation that's happening around ASCO and to engage in the content being shared and the sessions presented. So you'll see actually Brazil and India, as the conference and Congress content went online, had an increase in participation. And we, even though it's still hybrid, we're still seeing this participation coming from outside the US.
It's really great, actually, to see a widening participation from countries not normally in attendance. So obviously ASCO is a US conference, but of course the data's got a huge global resonance. Later on in the presentation, we're actually going to talk about how some companies are working to localize this content to different languages and to make it more readily accessible for healthcare professionals who don't speak English as a first language.
So when looking into the top hashtags that are being used, so we can clearly see that the general ASCO or the conference hashtags were the most used. But also when we are looking into disease-specific hashtags, we can see that specific hashtags around lung cancer, breast cancer, and some other cancer forms are also being used quite widely. And they are being used by a lot by healthcare professionals. And one interesting finding that we can see over there, that in almost 30% of those hashtags wherein people are using the different disease terms like abbreviations with social media, we can see that they are either tagging or mentioning onco alert, which is a association of professionals, HCPs as well as patient advocates globally, working towards eradication of cancer. So this was one of the interesting findings that we saw from the usage of hashtags at ASCO.
And if you want to be noticed when posting at Congress, it's always important to make sure you're using the right hashtags. And as you can see here, and as Abhinav showed, there's several different variations of the ASCO hashtag that people are using here, but the official one was used most widely. So if you're preparing any comms around the Congress, always check the Congress Twitter handles or website to see what they use. The oncology space has got many of its own hashtags that you can see here, such as BCSM, breast cancer social media, and LCSM, lung cancer social media. So those are not just used by healthcare professionals, but also by lots of patient groups and other experts working in the field. And again, when preparing communications, using the right hashtags is a good way to be seen by the right communities and audiences. And following those hashtags is a great way to learn what matters and in real time.
Okay, so looking into the top authors at the event by number of posts, so we can again see that Onco Alert is the topmost author that kind of posted the most number of posts around ASCO. But we can also see that it's a fair mix of different categories or stakeholder types. So we can see communities, we can see organizations, HCPs, as well as patient advocates. So this is a interesting finding because we see that generally HCPs are the by far as a group the highest have the highest number of contribution towards posts. But when it comes to individuals and specific authors contributing towards the highest number of posts, we can see that the other groups are also engaging and they also are playing an active and important role at ASCO. Okay, so we looked at the influential healthcare professionals as well. So the difference between, I would like to highlight over here that there is a slight difference between KOLs and KOIs. So so here we are looking at key online influencers who can be either key opinion leaders, like offline opinion leaders, or might not be. So there can be overlap, but there might not be overlap as well. So these are the most influential HCPs that we found at ASCO who are engaging the most, as well as had the highest number of followers around the event on Twitter. So one interesting fact that we can see over here is that the KOI landscape is ever changing at ASCO, right? So the top HCPs that we see coming into our top list of identified influencers almost change every year. And this year also we can see 7 out of 9 influencers are actually new, and we didn't they were not featured in our list in the ASCO 2020 event that we did covered last year. So yeah, so this landscape is pretty much ever changing, and it depends on how HCPs are changing. Either existing HCPs are changing their level of engagement around the event or their focus, or there are new and emerging HCPs who are coming into the perspective or the landscape. So that changes it. Yep.
Yeah, that this seems to be one of the kind of key learning opportunities for our clients, where there there's a very robust KOL list, and there needs to be an ongoing monitoring of sort of who those online influencers are. And the people who spoke most last year at ASCO are not the same people who speak or who spoke at this year's ASCO. But it is an opportunity for, in certain cases, for you to learn about who the top online influencers are here. And they're usually they're usually commenting on the data that's being presented, and then, you know, make some qualified guesses about whether they won't also be speaking at another conference later in the year, like ESMO or like San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference, for example, because the chances are that there will be similar data that's presented at later meetings. But one should really be keeping a regular eye on those KOIs, and finding ways to engage with them as you go. So it's another opportunity to sort of be flexible and nimble during the conference and follow these influencers and see where they take you. One point also is that it is not necessarily true that these online influencers and commentators are actually on at the meeting. We can find cases where they're reporting from remote locations. So keep an eye on these influencers.
As Kate mentioned, this content is coming from in the moment. So while we do social listening across all social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram and other online channels, where this conversation is happening is primarily on Twitter, and not just the content that's being shared, but how it's being shared and what is being shared. So the majority of content that's being shared are text and images. So that made up about 55% of the content that we saw. While there are other tweets that are just text only, or text and images and links, what we saw was that the largest volume was that text and image. And while we look at the averages across the different content that was shared, the majority of those images were taken in the sessions or between sessions. They weren't necessarily pre-made images that were set up and queued to go. We saw that there was across the board, kind of smaller levels of engagement on the average post, but some of the most highly engaged posts were getting not just hundreds but thousands of interactions. But where we weren't seeing a lot of engagement was around text and videos. So the tweets that had videos in them had some of the lowest engagement rates as compared to the other content.
Thanks. And as Jackie mentioned, the average post engagement is generally quite low, but it's probably not a surprise considering how many individual posts go out at the time of the Congress. And remember as well that this encompasses all Twitter users, including those with a big following and those with a small one as well. So we would normally never advise our clients to post just text only, for example. But at Congress, these posts are receiving better engagement. And that's because at this time, there's lots of peer-to-peer conversation. So one person posting, somebody else commenting on it, somebody replying. So what we can see here is active discussion in which those taking an interest in the Congress are sharing text posts, discussing what they've seen and what it means to them in their practice. They're also, as you can see, sharing links to content, images from the Congress, articles and published data.
So we have a few examples of the top posts by content type here for you to see. And you can see that those numbers, as I mentioned, were in the thousands. So one text with link has over 6,000 engagements, which could be a reshare, a comment, a like, any type of interaction.
And not all not all congresses allow you to use photos or take pictures in the hall. But I recommend you look for that policy, because when you are able to take photographs in the hall, those really do have the highest engagement and are the most watched. So if you can post in the hall, do, because I think you'll get some better engagement than without those posts, without those photos.
So when we're looking at not just the type of content that was shared, but the topics, we can see that the key cancer topics that were discussed didn't change that much year over year. So the same topics were mentioned. The percentages changed a bit, and that year over year shift correlates to the studies and trials that were shared during the presentations and sessions. And that is reflected also when we look at the mentions of those studies and trials. You can see that the largest volume of conversations when the trials were mentioned were discussing the breast cancer trial, so the Destiny trial, as well as a number of other key studies and trials that were released.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say here is that it just really shows that the conversations that the KOLs are having are really predominantly about the trials. So it just reminds us that this is such a good opportunity to listen to what the KOLs are commenting on, and even from a competitive analysis, perhaps where you have some competitive data coming out, sort of looking for where the weak spots may be and factoring that in. But it's a good listening opportunity.
When we're looking at the topics overall that are discussed, as Kate mentioned, it's pretty clear that the sessions themselves are the most highly discussed topic, and within those, it's the content that's being shared in the sessions. So the trials and study, awareness generation, and the important thing to note too is that these topics aren't mutually exclusive. So in the same tweet or conversation, you could have someone mentioning the session, mentioning the trial that's discussed in the session, as well as maybe using some of the hashtags for breast cancer social media, so that it's kind of raising awareness generation as well. So all of these things could be happening in one conversation.
Yeah, and this is, again, not surprising that the biggest conversations are around the data, but I think it's important to recognize that the second biggest is awareness and awareness generation, and disease awareness. Working with, so for example, if you don't have a lot of data, perhaps there is an initiative that you can engage with an advocacy group on. there are many advocacy groups who do a lot of work around ASCO, and this is a good opportunity, to perhaps work with them, even in a sort of a purely altruistic way of directing people towards initiatives that are valuable for patients, and really taking that opportunity if you don't have a lot of data. But it's good to see here that there's good engagement at the advocacy level.
So we did take a look into if people were mentioning the difference in between having an in-person conference again versus the virtual conference experience versus what was new this year, this hybrid experience. And while there was a few that mentioned the hybrid experience, most of the conversation centered around being back there in person, being there in the moment, having those hallway conversations, participating in sessions. And then that was followed by the virtual capability of those attending online. What was really quite funny was a lot of the people who were there in Chicago really appreciated this virtual opportunity or the hybrid experience, attending some of the early morning sessions from their hotel room, and then only later going to the conference facility itself.
It's also interesting, I'd say, here to note that even the in-person attendees are making use of that hybrid format. But I can say anecdotally that early in the pandemic, when everything was virtual, there was a real focus on trying to make the virtual experience as close as possible to the real thing. And I think this is also what we wanted to do as events started to become hybrid. How can we give that person at home exactly the same experience, or as close as possible to the person who's physically in the room? So there are many emerging technological solutions that exist, but I have to say my personal feeling is that they're not the same. And I think we've seen that in the conversation. And we probably shouldn't try to replicate the experience exactly. Instead, we should acknowledge the difference and focus on making the experience as valuable as possible, no matter whether the user is virtual or they're in person. So they're parallel experiences. They're different, but both can offer value in a different way.
So from the overall content and the engagement we saw around the Congress content, we have some key takeaways that we are going to share as recommendations for opportunities that exist to drive better engagement and collaboration in the future. We do have some specific examples that we're going to share. And as I mentioned, we do have more details on each individual pharma organization who participated. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know and we can share that with you in the future. But for now, we're going to share some of the key takeaways for you. So one of the first is that we saw pharma companies effectively driving engagement was using Twitter-specific polls and the use of specific hashtags. So they were using the online format where the conversations were happening, so within Twitter, and using some of the capabilities that Twitter offers to conduct these polls to ask questions of the attendees and participants of the content being shared or sessions that were happening or their perceptions or opinions of different topics. We also saw the use of, in case you missed it, so the hashtag that is known for resharing important information that should be shared more widely.
Yeah, we really do. We really love these cases and think that they are kind of best practices for making the most out of a medical congress without actually devoting an exorbitant amounts of budget. These are relatively easy to do. They're kind of cheap and cheerful, and also effective engagement strategies that actually yield important data for the client on what people find most interesting. So, Merck had a poll. If you're attending the meeting in live or virtual this year, what what interests you the most? What topics interest you the most? There are another one about what do you think the biggest impact on screening rates? These were important these were important questions for Merck to ask. And I think you can see just from the engagement that they were really effective at, planting some things into people's minds about Merck, as well as getting information. And then Novartis also had a really good online poll. So, when you're coming up with your overall social media strategy or conference strategy, this is, a great way to get good information, good engagement, and be visible, good awareness.
We also saw the co-creation of content with experts, specialists, and HCPs. So we saw video content being created and shared, and content not just in English. So there was content in Spanish language as well. And all of this had a very clear call to action. So it was asking for engagement, asking for participation.
Thanks, Jackie. I think this is a really great example of localizing content for audiences who don't speak English as a first language. So obviously it's not just at ASCO that all the presentations are in English. This is the case for EU meetings as well. And anything industry can do to make content more accessible to doctors who don't speak a good level of English is really welcome and really beneficial, especially if you involve a local influencer who can discuss the meeting and put those insights through a local lens. Now, we can't actually see the number of views for this specific video here, so it's difficult to determine exactly how successful this individual piece of content was, but it's a great initiative. And this kind of approach, which is certainly much more of a cost investment than what we were talking about in the previous slide, is definitely something that the industry should be moving towards, really widening that accessibility.
Okay, so when it comes to engagement, we also saw that technology also was being used by pharma to some extent. So wherein we can see that it was mostly used to create a combined like online offline kind of environment or experience, as we can call it. So wherein they were sharing, like pharma was sharing vital pieces of information through their virtual congress websites and kind of booths and all those kind of platforms, whereas they were also encouraging attendees to come to their offline booths through different kind of touch points, right? So they wanted to create an online plus offline kind of experience. We also saw that gamification was a particular kind of use case wherein technology was used to engage with HCPs in particular around testing biomarkers and performing biopsy tests for the CRAS G12C challenge, wherein Amgen did this. So yeah, so these are the kind of use cases of technology that companies like BMS and Amgen were doing at ASCO this year.
Creating the virtual Congress booth can be very costly. And, to tie back to our earlier point about acknowledging that the virtual and in-person experiences are different, companies need to really think about the level of investment that they're putting behind those virtual booths. And if there's an opportunity to not just, try to replicate the in-person experience, but to really try to get something more out of it, if that's the strategy that they want to go. But in my personal experience, the virtual booths have been costly, and there hasn't been a big return on investment. But when it comes to gamification and taking a long-term investment strategy view, I think Amgen's game console is a really good example of addressing a need in explaining to physicians or showing physicians the sort of advances in taking biopsies and getting biopsies, which is critical to their product strategy, and having it be a tool that you could use online and virtually with KOLs and potential customers, but also have it be something that you could use at the booth for every future subsequent medical meeting. I think will pay off for them, and is a sort of right in line with where the physicians want to be as far as really hands-on interactive kind of tools.
Okay. So another thing to highlight would be that we saw that pharma companies were quite focused around patient centricity and inclusivity as well. So we can see that over here, like Novartis had developed some dedicated content and videos as well as guidelines to help HCPs kind of make breast cancer black patients more comfortable and heard. So this was quite like they shared some informative videos as well as using of proper hashtags was seen. Apart from that, we can also see that co-creation of content with HCPs was done in terms of smaller videos, which were again very patient centric, because not only because of the content that was there in the video, but also the way that the videos were kind of done with kind of background music and using means to me kind of hashtag to show that their care and centricity towards patients, right? So one thing to note that again, these videos didn't receive a lot of engagement, active engagement in terms of likes, retweets and stuff like that, but they for a few of them had quite high viewership, so that shows their visibility and kind of spread in the overall social media space.
So diversity is obviously a hugely important topic, and many companies talk a lot about how diverse they are, but few are actually providing genuine practical support. So I really love this example from Novartis, the useful guide for doctors working with Black women and breast cancer. And again, this is another example of, if a company doesn't have a huge amount of data at a conference, which means there's going to be loads of attention on them, what value can they bring to the community during that period when all eyes are, in this case, on the oncology space? What value can you bring to your different stakeholders at this particular juncture?
So based on everything that we've talked about over the last half hour, Rick and I have kind of come up with a top 10 checklist for your social congress planning. And I'll start with number one, which is, to really know your story. Is this a big news conference for you, or do you just want to stay front of mind? Remember, you have major data announcement. When you have major data announcements, the audience will be talking about you already. But if you don't have this, then you need to bring something appropriate to the broader discussion, like we just talked about with Novartis. And you need to think about what value you can bring to healthcare providers, patients, and the broader general public, and make that your story. So if your story is data, then of course leverage that to with every opportunity. But you may have other things that are valuable that you want people to know about, or partnerships that you want to highlight that can also help you tell your story and know your story. The second tip is know your influencers. As we've previously mentioned, it's important to do your research and know who they are before the Congress begins. If you want to work with digital influencers, then you will need to allow a long lead time to get to know them, to develop the relationship and explore possibilities for collaboration and co-creation. So don't assume anything when it comes to your online influencers at medical meetings. They may not be who they were the year before. You need to be really doing a little bit of legwork in order to find out who they are for the next meeting.
So our number 3 is socialize your experience. When planning all aspects of your Congress experience, think about how you can make it easier for your audience to discuss on social media. So that could be using hashtags in your communications and on your booth as well. So thinking about those online and offline materials, employing QR codes to make it easy for people to share content on their own channels. And if you're going to include these elements in the exhibition hall, then you'll need to plan well in advance. So think about when you start your Congress planning, you should be thinking about your social then. Our fourth point is something we've been picking up quite a lot during this conversation is remembering both of those audiences, so the virtual and in-person audience. It's most likely your Congress will be a hybrid event. So think about what you can bring to the virtual audience or the person watching in their own time after the Congress, as well as those people who are there in person. For example, the virtual audience might like a daily summary podcast created with an influencer, whereas for that person who's there in the flesh physically, you might want to get them to, or you might want to share disease awareness content from your meeting. So again, build all of these experiences into your planning.
And then during the medical meeting, the conversation can get very loud. And whatever you're doing, it's important to listen and observe. This is a key opportunity to understand real time what conversations are happening and what your KOLs and others think about you, think about your competitors, think about the data. There's a rich sort of resource, it's a resource heavy opportunity to get some really smart intelligence. And then number 6, be prepared for people to ask questions on your social channels, particularly if you have a large involvement in the conference. And we've all developed those pre-approved Q&As with the pre-approved answers to potential questions that we've gotten, that we may get pertaining to our data, etc. But I think it's also important to be able to respond in real time. So being able to have somebody on hand, a member of your copy clearance committee or legal regulatory review committee, to be able to quickly approve anything that you really feel might need to be answered that hasn't already been addressed in your online Q&A or your prepared Q&A.
And so our step 7 is generate social content. So even if you're not going to be that busy, you're not going to be posting that much during the Congress, remember this presents an enormous opportunity to actually generate and create content. Where else do you have so many important KOLs and influencers in one place? So this could be anything from very high spec video content or even just some very short audio sound bites. Just remember to use this as an opportunity to build that bank of content which you can use when the news days are a little bit slower, or if you've got any future activities planned in your calendar, this would be a great time to capture some of that footage. Step 8 is to consider awareness opportunities. So Congress, as we've mentioned before, presents a fantastic awareness opportunity. Think about your patient groups that you work with. Think about how you can highlight the work of these groups during the conference and use your channels to boost and promote their voices. And then finally, we've got a couple of points for after the Congress as well. So number 9 is develop summaries. So after the conference, there's a great opportunity to summarize key takeaways for your professional audience. So all healthcare professionals, whether they're oncologists or a different type of healthcare professional, they're always busy. And working with a credible influencer to summarize the top insights from a conference can really add value. And also think about how you can localize this content to support local markets as well and reach those who do not speak English as a first language, a bit like the Novartis example we saw earlier. And finally, capture key learnings. What worked for you and others and what didn't. So looking at social metrics, HCP conversation, data like we've presented to you today, and also competitor activity is a great way to find out what worked, what didn't, and to plan for that next meeting you've got in your calendar.
So if you are interested in getting insights from different medical conferences and congresses, it really is important that you set up that listening or observation in advance so that you're able to capture all of the online conversation that happens over the course of the Congress and are able to identify those influencers who are communicating and contributing to those conversations. So we are at the end of our session, but we've had a couple questions come up. So one was, how far in advance do we need to think about or start planning to engage or have content? So I think this is kind of twofold. So I'll take it from the social listening side first, and then over to you guys at 9010 for the kind of engagement and content side of that question. So from the social listening perspective, it depends on what you're trying to learn. If you're trying to identify who are the influencers versus what do HCPs think of a key trial or study, or are you trying to gain competitive intelligence, you can, as long as you set up the social listening tools so that you're capturing data around the conference hashtags, you really want to do that in advance. And if you're planning to, so as I guess as little as a week in advance, you could have it set up, or even days. But the planning that you have around that would need to start much earlier. Rick or Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it really depends on the size of your general involvement as a company in the conference. So if it's a massive deal for you, you've got lots of data going, and you'll probably be beginning your Congress planning process very early as well, you should also start thinking about your social then. Because it's going to play a huge part, whether it's paying attention, whether it's socializing your booth, as we talked about. The kind of greater involvement, the earlier you should be. Just make sure that the social people are in the room at the beginning of those conversations. If you've got kind of a low level, or you're just there to listen, you don't really need to get involved till later, but you might want to have a think about some of the keywords that you want to follow. If you're working with a social listening agency or partner, just think about kind of setting up that plan before the conference so you're prepared. Kate, I don't know if you have any other things to add.
No, I would say, if you only to say, perhaps to put a finer point on it, that, if it's a low level engagement, then I would be, joining the conference planning meetings maybe 6 weeks out, to give yourself a couple of weeks to come up with your plan, get that through, sort of get that creative concept through the appropriate approval channels, so that you can develop the content and get that approved, sort of 6 to 8 weeks out for a low level, and then longer for high engagement.
So our second and last question here is, if they don't have a study or session where they're presenting content, so they don't have much to say, what can they listen to or learn from at a Congress?
So I'll just jump in by saying there are a number of opportunities at medical meetings for you to, as we saw with Novartis and others, to do online polls as an opportunity to better understand the concerns of the physician community around the topic of that is most important to you. It's an opportunity to certainly listen and gain insights into who's influencing the conversations for people around you. It's an opportunity to create content, as far as bringing KOLs together and creating some materials about the burden, or the disease category, or the platform that you're studying, that can be used at a later date when appropriate. There are a number of ways for you to make the most of the meeting, and it's also an opportunity, as I think I've mentioned, to engage more with an advocacy group or two who have initiatives of their own that you want to support and point people to.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Kate said. I'd say as the kind of bare minimum is you should always be listening. You should always see what people are saying, because I think, as we've shown today, it's so active in terms of all of the major audiences you're trying to reach, whether that's patient groups, whether that's healthcare professionals. Everyone's talking then. So at the bare minimum, you should always be listening. But above that, just think about where you can add value, and make sure that if you are putting out any communications during then, obviously it's the place of the healthcare professionals to talk. I think the AstraZeneca example about how they decided not to promote content during there, to let the doctors speak, is really valid still. But if you are going to take part in that conversation, how can we add value? How can we give something that benefits the community?
And that speaking to African American women about breast cancer is another great example of really valuable content that was put in front of the right audience at the right time that didn't have anything to do with data.
Yeah. And Rick, I know that you touched on this in Abhinav too, but HCPs, so the HCP participation and engagement and what you're able to learn from them is off the charts at medical congresses. So Abhinav, I know you mentioned that, during the rest of the year, within therapeutic area discussions, HCPs contribute less than 10% of the overall conversation. Here we're seeing them contribute almost half the content and at an exponential rate over other stakeholders. So it's a real opportunity to actually listen and learn from HCPs, especially as access to HCPs becomes even more limited. So thank you all for joining us today as we talk through this. And thank you, Kate, Rick, and Abhinav for sharing insights and recommendations. If anybody would like a PDF copy of this, along with more detailed stats and insights, we're happy to share that. Just let us know. And please join us all in the future for future LinkedIn Lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.